comments, contributions, and questions. I forgot to mention at the beginning that this meeting is on record and that it's actually being screened through the internet, although you can't see it live probably, but I'm sure the ODI will place it in their website. I would like to encourage the audience to comment and ask questions. And I would like to request those who are willing to contribute to identify themselves and the institutions that they represent, and then make a comment or contribution or ask a question. And we'll take, say, 3 to 4 questions at a time, and I'll give a chance to the audience, to the panel to respond. I'll start with the gentleman there.
Duncan Green from Oxfam. Thanks for the presentations. Couple of points. One is, I was in Zambia in February, and I also saw government officials really just not in denial about whether the crisis was serious. You say Ghana's doing the same thing. Which governments, apart from South Africa, are now actually recognising the gravity of the situation and are responding? And how are they responding? Is it mainly through social protection? Is it mainly through looking for new sources of finance? What are they actually doing? And second, there's been a lot of talk about the IMF 2.0, that this is a new caring, sharing IMF. It's just got $500 billion check on the promise of reform. So not from Washington, but from what you're seeing in Africa, is this a different IMF in terms of the kind of advice and the default thinking that it's showing, or is it the same IMF?
Thank you. The lady here.
Thank you. My name is Mo Awomolo. I work for New Frontiers Capital, which is a London-based investment vehicle for international investors to take opportunities in Africa. So we've heard very strong political and economic issues affecting the sustainability and growth and development of the continent. And a school of thought could counter-argue that there's not enough marketing coming out of Africa to adequately tap into global resources. And we know that the marketing budget in organizations can be notoriously expensive. So how can institutions like yours help to reduce costs of marketing and getting access to relevant African forums? In my view, I think this would encourage more African salespeople who are willing and capable to sell the African story.
Thank you for that question. The lady there.
Hello, Kate Bird, Growth and Equity Programme, ODI. I really enjoyed the presentations that were given and I learnt a lot. I've got a question to the panel as a whole, really. We see that GDP per capita declines are going to be quite formidable over the coming period. And the speakers have outlined the political implications and also the short and medium-term implications for investment. My observation is that the ability to absorb a shock of this scale in Africa is somewhat less than it might be in the UK or America, despite the fact that we're feeling the pinch and there's a lot of talk about it here. Actually, we've got the ability to absorb the pain, both politically and economically, over the short and medium term. But if we look at Africa, the ability to absorb the shock, both at the government level, in terms of their political ability to absorb the shock, but also in terms of their fiscal ability. But then if we look at the enterprise and household level, the ability to absorb the different shocks, I would argue, are significantly less. So I'd be interested to hear from the panel what they think the government policies, the African government policies should be, what should be the aid instruments, and what should be the behaviour of the private sector that will acknowledge that the shocks will play out in a very particular way in the African context. So what should those policies and behaviours be that ensure not only building back better, but policies that enable citizens now to cope with the impact of the crisis, both citizens and entrepreneurs?
Thank you. I think I'll give an opportunity for the panel to respond. I think there was a first question about the the state of denial of the crisis. Would you like to take that, Razia?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with. There was this generally a state of denial. I think it was denial in the West as well, because they suddenly thought, well, you know, they're going to have to sort of shell out more on the aid budgets. But as I said already, they're $25 billion behind their commitments made in 2005. That's the baseline figure. And the World Bank and IMF are talking about another $100 billion at least finance gap to make up the loss of export revenues. You've got a lot of shelling out to do, and they're clearly not about to do it. I think we have to be realistic about that. And I think the response is yes. I spoke to the Ethiopian Prime Minister after the G20 and the African Development Bank President. And I have to say, the African Development Bank President actually has been extremely proactive. They put out a really strong report showing how bad the crisis was, country by country, and it's really worth reading. I think it's the best piece of research that's actually gone out, better than anything the IMF or World Bank have done so far. But I was pretty shocked to hear that he wasn't too worried about the G20 response. He seemed to think it was a step in the right direction. It clearly is not nearly enough. Now, as for which countries are reacting, I think, Uganda and Tanzania, to an extent, have got enough fiscal space to relax a little bit, and they say, and they have deals with the IMF and World Bank, they're committed to maintaining levels of education and health spending, for example. Ghana is saying the same thing, actually. Now they've got a new government in place that's overtly committed to that. So that's a good sign. Rwanda, too, is also committed to maintaining those expenditures. But I think the way that a lot of other governments are reacting, unfortunately, is regime security. They feel that they're politically they're going to be up against it. They're going to see the food and fuel price riots that we saw last year in a half a dozen countries. We're going to see more of that coming in the year. So what are you going to do? Pay the police more, pay the army more, pay the intelligence services more, and make sure that the opposition don't get a grip on the situation and threaten the regime. So I'm afraid you're going to see a lot more of that going on.
Yep. Would you like to comment on the mechanisms policy mechanism to absorb the crisis?
From the fund?
Yes.
Yeah, when how it looks on the ground. Well, the IMF, very curiously, the IMF had this grand meeting planned in Tanzania back in March, and it was originally planned between Dominic Strauss-Kahn and Jakaya Kikwete to sort of celebrate the new leadership of the IMF, the kinder, more caring IMF, and marry that to Africa's fantastic growth record over the past decade. So they had this meeting, which they planned 18 months ago, to do all these things. And of course, then it happened in the middle of March in Dar es Salaam. And actually, all these people were turning up from civil society organizations in Africa saying, actually, this is terrible. It's the worst it's been since the 80s. So they had to try and do a public relations stunt on that. And what they did was say, well, yes, the crisis is bad. It's not as bad as some people say. And Strauss-Kahn said it's not, it really is going to be less serious in Africa than the rest of the world. And I totally disagree with that. I think it's the other way around, actually. And he said, but we are going to be much more liberal, and we're going to, we've got several facilities. We're going to abandon strict program conditionality. That is to say, if you don't have institute an anti-corruption commission on the 1st of March, it doesn't mean to say we knock you off the program and things like that. A lot of it, I'm afraid, is so micro. At the end of the day, the IMF is going to play a pretty key role in this, and I think it's going to be marginally more generous than it was with the Asian countries in the Asian crisis of '97, because it was accused of actually delaying recovery from those crises in '97. But I'm afraid it's not going to be terribly generous, because a lot of the countries that need it most, like Congo, Sudan, Liberia, and so on, just aren't going to make the basic fiscal criteria to qualify for the IMF programs. So I think there's going to be a lot more warm words from the IMF and a lot more policy advice and sympathetic-looking faces. But I don't think the cash that the IMF is going to come up with is going to make enough difference on the ground.
Thank you. Razia?
Sure. Just on that question on which governments apart from South Africa recognise the crisis, I think I would pretty much reiterate that on the whole, even though we're starting to get recognition from some governments that actually there is a crisis, one doesn't still get a full appreciation of the extent of this downturn and the impact that this is likely to have in countries for many years to come. There are certainly governments that have started to do some of the right things, so looking at the drying up of external flows, countries like Kenya, for example, doing very innovative things to try to tap the domestic market for financing, so reducing the threshold for investment in government debt, changing the regulation of microfinance institutions. These are small micro-sector type things, but ultimately they do have an aggregate impact. Kenya was one of the few countries that was able to borrow from the domestic market in very sizable quantities for an infrastructure bond recently, where when it found that external financing, the Eurobond it had been looking to issue, access to the markets was closed off to it. The problem with a lot of the other governments or the other policy measures put in place is they seem to be going at this too slowly. There is a problem. The crisis has already hit. The real economy crisis is already being felt. Increasingly, a number of governments are waking up to the fact that growth is not going to be in the 5 to 6% range, but one would be surprised at the number of speeches, conferences that are put together, the recent one just being one example of that, where the belief is that African economies are doing very well. Yes, the recent growth record has been exceptional, but it was about time that we started to see the sort of growth that these economies are capable of. The difficulty is in putting together a policy response that will try to safeguard that growth. And maybe if we can address the last question that was asked also, the ability to absorb a shock of this scale is going to be less in Africa. Yes, in a fiscal sense, in that very few governments, very few authorities, fiscal authorities in Africa will have this sort of savings that will be able to see them through this crisis. If we think of some of the better managed economies, Botswana springs to mind, years of having built up a budget surplus, but even they are finding that such is the nature of the downturn, having had to close down the mines for a period of 4 months, that real questions need to be asked about whether that history of accumulated savings is going to be enough. Now, other governments in Africa don't necessarily have those policy options open to them. There is going to be a need for accelerated reform, much more of a focus on doing what's necessary to boost the domestic debt market. This isn't something that can happen overnight, but there is a large untapped pool of savings or a potential to perhaps generate that, put it to a more productive use that just hasn't been done by a lot of the monetary authorities in Africa. So on the one hand, this crisis is serious. Perhaps the severity of the crisis isn't yet recognized by political leaders. But on the other, there are important reforms that did need to take place to accelerate Africa's development. And the hope is that the urgency of the crisis, the depth of the crisis will give more urgency to those reforms, and that we will, on the whole, see countries moving in the right direction towards emerging from this crisis in a better position to benefit from future growth.
There was a question here about the contribution that can make to marketing opportunities in Africa.
I think alongside the crisis, and we do all fall into the trap of only giving the bad news, there's still something to be said for the resilience of Africa's microeconomy. Of course, a number of different African countries have experienced different sorts of shocks in the past. What is frightening about this shock is that it's happening to just about every economy at the same time. So it's very difficult to look back to the past, as the IMF have done in their recent regional economic outlook, and say, well, on average, if global growth dipped 1%, you would see African growth contracting by maybe 0.3% in the first year and 0.2% a year after. The thing is, in the current crisis, we just don't know, because there hasn't been any time in recent history when we've seen this sort of concerted downturn with just about every region in the world being impacted. But at the same time, what we do know about the performance of African economies is A, there's probably a lot of economic activity that's gone unaccounted for, that isn't accounted for in the formal economy at all. There is a degree of resilience within Africa's microeconomies that doesn't receive enough attention. And there is this flexibility to be able to deal with crises at the micro level. Of course, it would be a very optimistic view to suggest that that is going to be the answer to the crisis, but I think there are going to be instances where certain countries perform less badly than others, certain sectors perform less badly than others, and those examples do need to be spoken about. But in the current mood, given the current situation, I think the danger is in trying to talk about those, you run the risk of downplaying the impact of the entire crisis on African economies. This is going to be severe. There is going to be a need to find a mitigant for what's happened to portfolio flows, whether private portfolio flows or what could still happen to official flows. So if you're focusing on some of the positives, and yes, better marketing is needed, I think that the greater threat is that takes attention away, that detracts from the very real need to find immediate solutions to the crisis.
Can I just say something about the marketing? I mean, I think...
No, I'll come back to you,
oh,
Patrick,
sure.
if you want. But let me go to Dirk first. Give time to Dirk to respond to some of the...
Yes. Well, thank you very much for those questions. I think that I think in the state of denial, yes and no, but particularly yes in the sense that countries are still not knowing exactly what the effects are going to be, and I agree with Russia on that. And that will in part depend on the severity of the crisis as well. So is it going to be a very long run crisis, or is it going to be a blip? And I think the economic forecasters here, everywhere in the world, they are not in agreement on that. And I think that's something to bear in mind. And that will also determine the policy responses, I think, is that if we are in a period of slower growth, slower finance, more heavily regulated finance, in some areas rightly so, then that has implications for a lot of things and for the policy responses, than compared to a situation if it's just a shock. I think that's something we need to bear in mind. From the sort of the Uganda case study, what came to mind was that some of the officials in the economic affairs ministries were suggesting, say, well, we are dependent on exports for quite a big deal and for a number of commodities, concentrated number of commodities, and now we see the exports being reduced. Shouldn't we now rethink about how we engage with the global economy? Now, I think that can be potentially quite harmful, and so there's this window of opportunity, where, and I agree with previous speakers that a lot can happen, but it can go either way, and it's that countries can have a knee-jerk reaction, say, well, we've been integrated in a global economy, and more so in the last few years, and it has brought growth, but now it brought all this volatility, so now we need to reduce our integration in the global economy. So I think that's something to bear in mind, that there are potential dangerous implications, and that you actually withdraw from the global economy altogether, become a protectionist, and actually worsen the crisis. In terms of policy responses, to answer Duncan and some others, I think we need to distinguish between short-term economic policies and long-term economic policies. This is a crisis of growth. Growth has been taken away from African countries, and if it is short-term growth that's been taken away, there needs to be steps like fiscal policies, monetary policies. Now, some African countries have introduced some small monetary steps, like Kenya and Uganda. They have used monetary policy. Maybe they could do more in terms of currency ratios and so on. Fiscal policies they have not used on the whole, and not as much. And maybe that's due to the lack of fiscal space, although some countries will have more fiscal space now. They can import oil at a cheaper price. So there might be a little bit of space there. But others will not have the space to do so. Long-term policies, I think that's something that needs to have continued emphasis, because the best way to get out of this crisis is to grow faster and to get good growth policies. And I think the international system has to be able to respond to those requests. So if countries need more infrastructure financing, and the bond issuance market has dried up, then what other mechanisms are available development finance institutions, IMF resources, and so on, can they be used to finance growth policies?
Thank you, Dirk. We'll take a second round. We'll start with the gentleman there. Faces the back. Oh, there's somebody waiting. Okay, sorry.
Steal the microphone, sorry. Alison Evans, ODI, new director of ODI. That was a terrific outlining, I think, of many of the challenges that we're beginning to see unfold in relation to the impact of this crisis on Africa. But I kept thinking in my mind as you were talking, all three of you, do we have here the building blocks of a kind of macro narrative here on the development story for Africa going forward? And I at times felt, well, maybe we do, and other times felt we don't. And I suppose the two areas for me that need a lot of filling in. One is the human development story of this. If we thought MDG achievement was going to be difficult in Africa before this crisis, it is certainly going to be difficult now. And particularly in areas of nutrition, maternal mortality, this is now a huge burning issue. And to what extent what we've heard today around the table has a bearing on that, I think it'd be useful to tease out. But more importantly, what is the G20 doing for us in terms of keeping the MDG story and the off-trackness of many of the MDGs on the continent firmly on the agenda? And of course, its relationship to the wider international system is crucial on that. But the second piece is really the upside of this. What are the opportunities that need to be grasped now? Clearly, one can see that this is a slow-burning crisis of 1,000 cuts, which we're yet to see the sort of full dimensions of. But surely this is the time to be also starting to think about the upturn and where are African economies going to be positioning themselves and how to make sure they're part of the upturn as and when it happens. And in fact, if Simon Maxwell, my predecessor, was standing here, he'd be reminding us all that back in the days of the Brandt Commission, one of the big stories around the Brandt Commission story on development was precisely what developing countries can do for the North. And I think this is a classic moment where we need to start thinking about what a return to growth in Africa will do for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman there at the back, and then you, sir.
Hello, thank you. Mike Street, just an independent observer. I would just like to follow actually up on that last comment about what Africa could do for the rest of the world economy, because, and thank you very much for this very fascinating and complex presentations here, but just last October, the UNEP presented a green economy initiative to redirect some of this finance into developing economies, to produce win-win-win situations where green demand would stimulate the green economies in our own polluting societies. And that seems to have been sort of forgotten for the time being. On the question of denial, Meles Zenawi, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, in February, I don't know if anyone ever saw it, but when he addressed the heads of the AU, he gave one of the grimmest warnings from Africa since the 1960s, when he warned that there could be a lot of failed states. He talked about a 10-year, very painful transition period up ahead. And after that, the likes of Ban Ki-moon, Al Gore, Tony Blair and Jeffrey Sachs and others was calling for a Green New Deal to address this problem, to turn this around. And various countries then started giving certain percentages of their stimulus package over to green. North Korea was 84%, United States is 12%, UK 8%, something like that. Italy and Spain are way down on the list at 1% only for the green. So that means still most of the stimulus is still going into 20th century behavior and technologies and economies. The G20 tried to address this. They didn't commit anything to a green stimulus. They did say they didn't put down any percentages. But it seems to me now is the time to really address this problem of climate change and the way we live and the way we are spending our money and consuming. And if we promote green growth in Africa, because Africa already has nearly 20 years head start. The African Green Revolution was launched possibly as early as 1992 in Ethiopia. And now is the time for us, I think, to really start looking at Africa and what Africa needs, the African demand, the green technologies. The only way forward is to keep the green technologies coming into Africa, because all the big projects that are being abandoned by India and China are all big 20th century style technology.
Thank you.
And just one final thing on the IMF. A lot of people have been calling for the IMF reform for maybe the last decade or so. Now all of a sudden they've got a huge responsibility, and quite a few people in the IMF are saying they simply don't have the expertise or the staff to even handle this. And Meles Zenawi has said that funds must start flowing by the third quarter of this year, otherwise we could start seeing very serious problems.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It took so long.
Thank you.
But it's a big subject.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
I'm Benny Dembitzer. I don't belong to anything. I'm so independent that I don't appear even on the list here. But I wanted to ask, Chairman, my reading is that there will be appalling food shortages in about 5-6 months across most of Africa. I would like to take the panel back to the statements made by the World Bank at the end of August last year, when it said that it had made a terrible mistake. Very sorry about that. But the number of people who were possibly starving was around about 1.2 billion and not 850 million because of some statistical errors in the PPP evaluations. Now, all I've heard this afternoon from the speakers is that with remittances going down, the very last word that Dirk mentioned was population growth, which everybody tends to forget. There will be more and more food shortages because not enough food is being grown anywhere in the world. Now, my question to the panel is, how do they see this very, very basic element, which will be the starvation of millions of people? I was involved very closely in the relief operations in Ethiopia 20-odd years ago, and you know, the idea that we are going to go through that again is quite frightening. But there are a number of agencies represented in this room, not only Duncan from Oxfam, but the Red Cross and the Treasury here. I just wonder whether, Chairman, you could ask them what provisions are being made for the appalling death toll that will occur from about September, October of this year. There's little rains across most of the Sahelian central belt of Africa this year have been actually good, from what I read. Perhaps Patrick will correct me. So that there is food now, but that's not, the reserves are not there. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The lady there, and finally the gentleman.
Hi, yes, I'm a student from the LSE. Thank you very much for your talk. I just would like to know, what do you think could be the potential role for sovereign wealth funds to play in the response to providing more stable and long-term financial flows to African countries? And how do you think we could encourage such inflows?
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Willem. I'm a researcher in international law and development. I just want to ask whether, could it be said that the process of economic globalization as currently constituted actually is meant to not to favor Africa? I said this because when the first speaker was presenting, the initial suspicion was that Africa would be immune. And why this initial suspicion held true was the fact that Africa was actually excluded from the benefit of capitalism when capitalism was triumphing. But I'm somehow intrigued that Africa is going to suffer the most. And that raises a question for me. Could it also, the second question, could we also say that from what is happening now, that IMF prescription to Africa is actually faulty. And then how do we reform IMF? Because Africa is going to suffer the most, but they have no voice. Reading through the constitutive document of IMF World Bank, it is clear to me that we won't be able to even push for reform in these settings. So what could be done actually to give Africa a voice so that these reforms could make meaning? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'll come back to the panel now, and I'll start on my right. Give you a chance to start.
Well, thank you very much for these very challenging and important questions and issues. I think, yes, what can the G20 do for development? And I think that one of the sort of good things about the outcome or the G20 process so far has been that at least Africa was included, and a number of Africans were around the table on the 2nd of April here in London. And I think that's something to celebrate, and it's also something to carry forward and to ensure that happens. And I think after the first summit in the US in November, I think there was the G20 summit, there were still some questions about, well, is development really going to be important for the G20 in London? And it has turned out to be important, at least in words, and that's something now to carry forward and to make sure that it's being implemented. So I think that it's part of a process, and it's going in the right direction. The crisis also provides opportunities for developing countries, and growth in developing countries will provide opportunities for developed countries. I think back in the 70s and 80s, and some major companies were dependent on sales and profits in developing countries, and it was developing countries who made sure that the companies were still solvent. Of course, now it's going to be different because all of us, all countries are in it, and I think that is slightly worrying. But that said, I think that developing countries can help the global economy also move out of a recession, because some of the marginal returns of investment can be higher in developing countries than in developed countries. In developed countries, particularly those that have had a large consumer spending booms, they need to increase their saving rates, and quite quickly. And you can delay it for a little bit, but it needs to go up. The countries where spending would be used, it's probably developing countries which are fiscally, which are restrained and capital constrained. So I think that's where they can help the global economy pull themselves out of the recession. And that's all I think is a part of the macroeconomic narrative, is basically developing countries and the poor can help us in that sense. And that's another opportunity. It was last month there was a conference in Rotterdam where there were some consultants there who said they'd been approached by business, major Dutch business, and say, well, we've done these operations now in Holland for quite some time. We now want to do some cost savings. We want to offshore to developing countries, and you might see some more pressure on companies in developed countries, which might benefit developing countries over the long run, if there's going to be more offshoring going to be happening. I mean, a final issue about sort of green growth. I mean, I think that's very important as well. In terms of global financial crisis, there is a shock happening now. You want to have short-term and long-term issues. Long-term climate change is the biggest market failure of all. That needs to be addressed, of course. In the short run, there are also market and coordination failures related to the financial markets and so on that need to be addressed. And I think the right responses will depend on the country context. In some economies, you need to work on the supply side in terms of stimulating growth, and others you need to work on the demand side and stimulate the demand side. You need to give the poorest cash and income and to protect themselves from the outcomes, and also to stimulate the economy. And yet other situations, it might well be good to think about innovation, growth, and particularly those types of innovations that are greenest. And I think that is it will depend on sort of the country context what is best in the long term.
Would you like to comment on the MDGs question?
Yes, no, I mean, I think that MDGs, I think that development has become part of the G20 vocabulary, and I think that's important. It's also important to realize that MDGs is an important framework. There are also shocks that face us at the moment, and major shocks in it, and I had mentioned them in the presentation. The food price shock, the fuel price shock, the financial crisis shock. There might be health shocks, security shocks, shifts in global governance. There are all of these different things. So I do think that we also need to think about what happens in the medium and long term in terms of development frameworks.
Thank you. Razia, would you like to comment on the positioning of Africa in the upturn, and also, I think, the role of sovereign wealth funds?
A couple of things to address there. I think the issue of will Africa suffer the most is an interesting one. If we were to look just at our forecasts of a number of different countries, it's clear that Africa, from that perspective alone, on paper, is not going to be suffering the most. Across the developed world, we're looking at a contraction in growth this year. It's a done deal. It's very difficult to see this playing out any other way. If we're looking at the more open emerging market economies, very reliant on exporting into those markets, they too are likely to see a significant contraction in growth this year. But the encouraging thing is we're already seeing signs that maybe the turnaround will be relatively quick. They went into the crisis with healthy fundamentals, so maybe from that perspective 2010 looks a little better, and we shouldn't downplay the impact of the domestic stimulus. From that perspective, a lot of African countries should still achieve positive growth because they are starting from such a low base. It would take a very, very significant crisis to be able to knock that into negative territory. That doesn't mean all African countries are likely to see positive growth. If we're looking just at the largest economies, our forecast for South Africa is certainly that there'll be positive but very low positive growth. In Nigeria, we're expecting to see the rate of growth halved, but that, in the context of the recent boom in Nigeria, will still feel like a downturn. The problem is that those kind of macro growth figures don't really quantify what is happening on the ground. Are there significant welfare costs associated with this crisis? Almost certainly. The question about what does all of this mean for human development and the achievement of the MDGs, it's still very early to try to tell what is going to happen, but the worrying signs are there. There was a comment on food shortages in Africa. While perhaps I'm not very qualified to talk about that, what we do note is that unlike just about every other emerging region, every other developing region where we are starting to see signs of disinflation, inflation coming down, the very worrying thing in the context of sub-Saharan Africa is that we're not seeing that at the consumer level. Fuel prices have come down globally, or oil prices have come down, food prices have declined, but something is happening at the consumer level of inflation in Africa that is keeping inflation high, and that is likely to be hitting the poorest hardest. This is something that we think does need more attention. Just moving very quickly to the question about the potential role for sovereign wealth funds. I think one of the things that African economies must be gearing themselves towards, or a way of coming out of this crisis, is certainly to widen the investor base further. There's no question that a diversity of investors will act as some sort of mitigant to future crises. It may not help completely in a situation where all countries experience a downturn at the same time, but it always helps to have that option open, to see that diversification of investment. There are questions, however, still, I think, around the transparency of those flows and what it means to see more government-to-government engagement in the context of Africa. What is needed for private sector growth, which is ultimately going to be delivering the welfare benefits in African economies, and how is that question clouded over by a more active role for sovereign wealth funds? This is something that does need to be looked at more closely, although we do stand by the original suggestion. If there are opportunities to be grasped now, hopefully that is much more accelerated reform, looking at intra-regional growth, looking at diversifying the investor base open to African economies, whether that's domestic, intra-regional, or looking further afield, and doing a lot more to deepen debt markets.
Thank you. Patrick?
Sure. On the food issue and on the positioning, I think what one area, and I know there's a lot of work being done on it in Africa, African Development Bank particularly, is for massive investment in agricultural production and processing in Africa. And that clearly has got to be an area of real concentration over the next couple of years. First of all, as you say, primarily to deal with the ongoing food crisis. And I mean, things have obviously got a lot worse last year when we saw the food price riots and so on. But I think the research, the ODI's research indicates that malnutrition rates in Africa are somewhere between 30 to 40% across the continent. And that's, you know, a third of the children born on the continent are being maimed as a result of insufficient calorific intake. That's when we had a period of good economic performance, or, you know, historically good economic performance. We've now got a period of seriously bad economic performance on the global level and correspondingly low economic performance in Africa. So I think, you know, it doesn't require much calculation to work out that's going to have very serious effects on food supply in the continent. So it's clearly, that's got to be one area, but of concentration. I think someone, you asked about marketing and so on, and just want to come back to that. That's an area where, indeed, the more Africa captures of the value chain, for something like agricultural production and processing and marketing, coffee, cocoa, all those food products here, the diamond industry, to name an obvious one, $8 billion a year used to be the total revenue from bringing diamonds out of the ground. $80 billion is the total income from the diamond industry, which is most of all the marketing of diamonds. So, you know, where Africa was the biggest diamond producer, it was getting less than a tenth of the value of that. So, I mean, that speaks to getting geared up to doing much more marketing as we get out of this crisis. I think the other issue is globalization stacked against Africa. Well, I remember when Claire Short became Development Secretary, when she used to be left-wing, she said she was against globalization. Someone said, well, being against globalization is a bit like being against English weather. You know, I think there's some point in that. But clearly, one of the things you can do is just as you can get under a bus shelter or buy an umbrella, you can mitigate the worst effects of it. And I think that speaks to African states in alliance with their allies across the world, making a really big push for reform of the world trade system. Pascal Lamy wants to get Doha going again. I think that's absolutely critical, and it may be a good moment to do this when everyone's feeling a bit sorry for themselves, to try and push through some reforms. You seem to have a more sympathetic government in the United States that does talk about ending the absurd and obscene level of subsidies. In America, if that happens, then I think the Europeans will then appear to be naked in the conference chamber, ditto the Japanese. And I think there might just be, if Obama is serious about doing something about subsidizing domestic producers, that might just have a knock-on effect in Europe and Asia. So there's some opportunities there.
There was one question about the role that developing countries can do for the developed world. Somebody wants to pick that up? You want to pick it up?
Well,
okay.
I think that had already been partially answered, but maybe one thing we do need to recognize is, in looking at this crisis, there's obviously been a lot of gloom and doom about African economies not having the fiscal space to provide much of a boost to their economies, much in the way of counter-cyclical policy response now. But the flip side to that is, if you look a few years down the line, we are going to be facing a situation where the countries that do have the ability to put in place sizable fiscal stimulus packages today are going to have to be paying for that. And that necessarily is going to have an impact on future growth rates. Where is the growth going to come from? It's going to be from those emerging, those developing regions of the world that are not saddled with that kind of debt. And the hope is that Africa will be right up there. We may talk about the vulnerability today because of the low economic base, but that can only translate into, one hopes, faster growth tomorrow.
Thank you. I think we're running out of time, so I will allow maybe 2 or 3 questions, quick questions, and I'll start with the lady there, and then sir.
Hi, Thank you. I'm Lindsay Craig from DFID. 2 questions. I hope it's not cheeky, but I thought, as we have the High Commissioner of Mozambique here, I would really like to hear your views, actually.
I'm chairing.
I know you're chairing, but I thought maybe we could have the opportunity of what you feel about Mozambique's response and how the government is responding. And then the second question is to Patrick at the end on the political economy. And the question really is I think it's really interesting what you were saying, and whether you feel there's it's just a role of trying to understand it better, or actually you think that the international world should be doing something as well in responding.
Thank you. I think there was a second question.
Alexander Woolcombe, Peace Child International, formerly of Oxfam, where I was writing a report about Sierra Leone and the impact of the credit crunch there. And there was a great amount of concern within government circles about the credit crunch. It wasn't that they weren't taking it seriously, but the primary export was diamonds, and they've seen diamond exports collapse. And so there was a feeling that there wasn't very much that the government could do, and there was still, as you've been saying, a lot of disagreement about what the impacts really were and what they were going to be, because so much of the economy is very hard to measure. And the thing that I found through the research that I was doing was that remittances was one thing that kept on coming across at all levels, and it's something that you've all mentioned here today, but again, it doesn't seem to be one of the issues that has a lot of policy response recommendations to it. Everyone always says, remittances are really important, but no one ever really seems to come up with many ideas for what can be done to harness development benefits from that. So your thoughts on that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you. One last question or comment before I hand it over to the panel. Yes, sir.
It's just regarding as you were saying earlier, that all growth won't be eliminated. I was wondering if will the economies actually, the nature, the character of those economies remain constant, and will it be a flat level growth or decline across different sectors of the economy, or will there be some areas that remain stronger than others? For example, would it be sort of small business decline, for example, while larger scale sort of resource gathering operations might remain strong, and whether that could have an impact, for example, on the political character of any state in that situation, kind of thing.
Thank you. I'll start with the panelists and then I'll pick my question. Can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. I'd like to pick up on sort of one issue, which is about which is Lindsay's question, I think. Which is about the nature of response, and it's also in relation to another question early on. Some countries are responding faster than others, and the question is why. And some countries are not responding at all. Again, the question is why. I think a country which is still in Africa, although it is it's Mauritius. It has responded very fast, in a very fast way. It's also a country where there are very good state-business relations and where there's a good discussion going on. It has flexible institutions, and it has a fast way of responding to challenges. That's actually the sort of the base of the last 20, 30 years. It had structural reforms, and it was able to respond to new challenges and moving up the value chain from commodities to textiles to services by using flexible institutions and good state-business relations. And I think that's also what we see in the country case studies that we have been coordinating, is that that there's a big difference in terms of what are the institutions that countries have put in place, or what do they already have in place to respond to the crisis, and that some countries have task forces put in place to monitor the situation and to come up with policy responses. Others don't have that. They don't have communications among ministries, among public and private sector, and I think it's hugely important because while we were at the that's my last point in Nairobi presenting the country case studies of Uganda and Kenya, it paints a sort of gloomy picture, 3-4 percentage point of growth, And then the private sector started talking, and they said, well, it's much worse. There were some bankers that said, well, we've actually experienced the economic activity in the last few weeks going down dramatically. And of course, the researchers weren't able to capture that in the sometimes less than high frequency data. And it's the private sector sometimes know some things that are happening much before it appears in official statistics. And if you have good communications amongst the public and the private sector, and if you put in place task forces to address crises such as these, it's likely to help your way in responding to the crisis. And I think Mauritius is an example there. It has put in place a number of policies to address the crisis. Whether it's enough is another matter, and they will always be constrained in the external environment, but at least they're doing something.
Thank you. Razia, would you like to?
Sure. Perhaps if I address the question of whether that question of how economies will emerge from this crisis, it's almost certain that the nature of the economy is likely to change. But I think it's very difficult to say a blanket, yes, it's likely to be the small informal sector that emerges in better shape. Overall, that's going to be a function of the liquidity environment, and in particular, the big macro influences will be felt. The trickle down, or the absence of that trickle down, will be felt very early on, even in the informal economy. And of course, the availability of credit. So these are things that do need to be monitored very closely for trying to forecast the growth outcomes in individual economies. But on the whole, there has been a trend underway in most sub-Saharan economies recently, and that isn't so much just growth of the formal economy as we've known it, but for innovation to happen, for things to happen that bring the informal economy into the formal economy. The growth of mobile telecoms, for example, what it suggested about the actual size of many countries is an example of that. And it's very difficult to see, even in the middle of a crisis like this, that trend is going to be entirely reversed. So I think we are certainly going to see a change in the makeup of economies, but very difficult to say exactly which sectors benefit at the expense of others.
Thank you.
Perhaps I just talk about the issue of policy change in the West and how that can help it. I think it's quite instructive. When this crisis broke in the middle of September, there were a lot of mea culpas on behalf of the barons of the financial system, and a lot of talk about transparency and accountability. 6 months later, we hear very little about accountability and transparency. We hear a lot about regulation instead. And I think it's up to everyone to really push for much more accountability and transparency in the international financial system. That would do, as I said, several things to try and clean up the international financial system, where Africa is clearly a net loser in the current structures, and that would be to really to deal with this issue of tax havens, to get companies to publish their tax accounts and actually pay tax in the countries in which they operate, rather than pay tax to the Cayman Islands, which doesn't appear to have very stringent demands on its educational and health services, and reforms on that, and also I think a big push on trade law and trade rules. I think would go some way to mitigating the effects of the crisis, and also preparing Africa for the upturn.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, the response from Mozambique, I think it's important to bear in mind that when the financial crisis struck, Mozambique was already suffering the effects of the food crisis and also the oil crisis that had a great impact on the economy. And it's also important also to bear in mind that the fiscal position of Mozambique is very limited. The country expenditure is equivalent to 34% of GDP, of which only around 17% is funded internally through revenue collection, and the balance being paid, being met by foreign aid or international grants. So as far as the fiscal space is concerned, I think is very much limited. I had a number of people mentioning that Africa was in denial. My own perception is not so much that the countries were in denial, because the same factors that Patrick and Razia mentioned, which mean that most analysts did not anticipate the crisis, were precisely the same crisis that made the African governments, some of African governments, react the way they reacted. Everybody was talking about the transmission through the financial mechanism, and what African governments were saying is that they were sort of insulated from that effect, but the real impact came through the real economy. I think, as Patrick mentioned, there was the belief that the Asian countries like India and China could somehow, manage to serve as a buffer for the African economy, but that didn't happen. But that was kind of analysis that was coming, not necessarily that the governments were being in denial. And Mozambique was one of those countries that at the beginning this was the kind of analysis, but as the crisis unfolded, all of us changed our minds because the evidence on the ground showed that the situation was different. And the reaction by the Mozambican government was precisely what Mauritius did, put together a task force to monitor the crisis. That task force is in place. It's at cabinet level. It reports to the Council of Ministers. So the measure that can be taken, they are being proposed by this special task force. But we're already feeling the impact in the sense that some major projects have been postponed. Some major companies have already started laying off their workforce. We're seeing the suspension of production. There are companies that suspended the production. For instance, Mittal suspended their production of steel in Mozambique, and they postponed the investment project. We have seen a number of projects, including the titanium project by BHP and other projects. And we had a number of major projects outlined that needed a lot of capital, but at this particular point in time, it's difficult to say when we'll be in a position to bring those projects back. But having said that, the Mozambican economy is still going to grow by an estimate of between 5 and 5.5%, which is a drop from the previous performance, but still it's not a negative growth. So this is what I could comment, even being a chair, and to say that we have had what I can consider very fascinating discussion, and I wouldn't even dilute the views of the panels and also of the audience by trying to summarize. I would like just to ask all of you, the audience, to join our hands together to thank our panelists for what I consider to have been an exceptional and informative debate. So thank you.